2022 and 2023, great years for zero RB. Even in those seasons, you can see teams that did not have a running back in round 8, round 9, round 10, those teams are significantly lower than the teams that finally added their first running back in that round 5, 6, 7, 8 range. And that's even with, like, I'm assuming a lot of those teams had Devon Achane, Kyron Williams, you name the late breakout running back, you still, it just did not matter that you had that 6 wide receiver versus just staying afloat and adding some running back points. That's kind of like the evidence that I have is in half PPR, even in those 0 running back years, the drop off from scoring, if you didn't have a running back in rounds 8, 9, 10, was pretty significant versus the teams that finally drafted one in round 6 or round 7.
How to avoid mistakes when you're drafting zero RB in 2025. Everyone knows one of my favorite topics in the whole entire world, but that's what we're going to talk today with Hayden Winks of Underdog. Looking forward to jumping into an article that he recently published over on the Underdog Network website, and we're going to work our way through some of the talking points in that. But as we get ready to kick it off, Hayden, how are you doing here? I touched on it just before we started recording, but training camp is now kicking into full gear. It feels like there's a little bit more electricity in the air when it comes to trying to keep up with NFL news.
Maybe too much electricity. It feels like we're putting a huge premium on these training camp clips. It's a good sign that the NFL is growing. It feels like training camp's like even bigger news than it was previously. And what you're kind of noticing is like arguably like fewer like solid beat reporters per team, but more clips posted by fans or like fanalists, which I also appreciate their input too. But you're seeing like a lot more like uncontextualized clips and stats from training camp. And I fear that people are going to pay attention to those and it's going to lead you into the incorrect direction.
Yeah. There's no more time like the present, especially with social media, to look at like media literacy and what's going on. And like there was one that had gone around over the weekend, I believe it was Sunday, and it was about Aaron Rodgers like throwing the ball out of bounds. It's Mason Rudolph, that throws the pass, but it has like 10,000 likes, and it's like, let's like, and people are just so hungry for that information. And if it's a player they dislike, for example, to jump on top of it, we are going to save it for the second show this week. I am going to talk a little bit about how we should react to that training camp news, because that can be very, very tough for people, particularly in the age that we're in at the moment with social media and so much information to try and digest. But the piece, you titled it "Don't Be Dumb When You Draft Zero RB in 2025." And, it's a very catchy title. It really fits in there. But just kicking off with the broad spectrum of like 2024, how that season played out, and then you're heading into the 2025 season. How did you think that the results of 2024 with some of those strong running back seasons would fit into the landscape for drafters in 2025?
So just looking at what happened on Underdog the last 4 best ball mania cycles, zero RB, which I'm just defining right here, is 0 running backs through round 5. That happened 7% of the time 4 years ago. Then it went up to 11%, 14%. And then this last season, it was actually at 34%. And that coincides with the 2 previous seasons before last year, where zero RB was like unquestionably some of the best zero RB years there, where we had like awesome late round running backs. And then also the early wide receivers were also great at the same time. So this was like the perfect storm for the rise of popularity. So that's about like a 5x increase. And of course, the second everyone kind of goes into that is one of the worst zero RB years. And that you still had some hits. Like you could have built a Chase Brown, Bucky Irving team and figured this thing out, but there was too many early running backs that were absolute smashes. So because it was working and it was rising, I think that because it failed, we're going to see that number crash down once again. And I think we're probably looking at zero RB more of like kind of like the sweet spot where we have to kind of critically think exactly what zero RB means. Why are we doing this? Where a couple of years ago is probably just like, look at the projections. These running backs are just obviously way inferior versus the wide receivers. You just draft those positions, where now I think the market's kind of adjusted here. So I think this is going to be pretty critical in exactly how we view what zero RB even is in 2025 with the new ADP landscape.
Yeah, and I think like you're mentioning, the sweet spot. I'm guessing in the kind of between 10 and 15%, but I think 12% is probably where it's going to kind of settle in. But when we look at like, because so many people did adopt it with the success, like at RotoViz, we've been like championing it for like over a decade, and it was always kind of the contrarian idea, and it was like. But obviously, like we had some major wins over the last couple of seasons, and then that led to it being adopted at a much higher rate than I had ever anticipated, because it felt like even like 4 years ago, you're like against a wall. But then now, obviously, it has made that big jump forward. And then when it fails, I think it puts it back into a great environment to attempt it again. But we're going to talk about that later in the show. But in terms of the 2025 ADP and how it's set up with the results, how are you seeing that being maybe different from the expectations at the end of the season for how like the running backs are kind of being ranked? And I think ADP this year is pretty spot on in terms of like we've just seen people get smarter at drafting, but anything different than your expectations?
Well, I think this over the last couple of years, the wide receiver price tags like significantly jumped at the expense significantly of the running backs. Actually, if the running backs have like dropped more than like the wide receivers have pushed up, just because elite tight ends, elite quarterbacks have gone up. And this is just looking at half PPR underdog data for now. So I was maybe there was going to be a case where like the running backs were going to like kind of like go back up in price where they were a couple seasons ago. Didn't really change all that much. Like the ADPs generally are pretty similar this year versus this past season, which I think is probably right. I think like last year, the 0 RB teams got like pretty unlucky. If you just like zoom out over the entire course of the season, like running backs primarily stayed healthy, wide receivers got unfairly just injured. And I think that more or less, like we probably had very generally like the correct ADP. So I'm not all that surprised here at all. And it's still kind of like the same narrative of like last year, like the reason why many people were out on the running backs is because the age concern hasn't gone away. It's just the older running backs all were just the best picks this last season. So yeah, I think the ADPs are like generally about right versus where they were this past season. And it's just more about like, yeah, last year, everything went right for like a robust running back. And we know that's just like not going to be the case long-term here. So like what's the equilibrium point? I think that we're probably not too far off from that.
Yeah, and I thought there might be a push, as you kind of hinted at, that it hasn't really happened, where running backs would really move up into those kind of top, say, 5 rounds. But when we look at the way it is, and you hit there on it, kind of with the older running backs, there was a little bit of a perfect storm with like Saquon changed teams, and like running backs changing teams at that point of their career generally don't have the success that we've seen there. We also would have had that bet against Derrick Henry, and obviously for both of those, it worked out in a really strong way. So there was a number of areas where, outside of Christian McCaffrey, a lot of good health led into situations where those guys were able to thrive in those situations. But the other part, when we're looking at ADP, this year and trying to project ahead to what those opening rounds look like in 2026, it's hard to want to think that far ahead, but that's where we're heading towards. But we have a huge veteran presence off running backs in those opening 2 rounds versus what maybe we would have had in previous years. And there is a chance that while now it feels to a lot of drafters that these are the correct ADPs, and I would even go as far as to say that they probably are, but the floor could fall out very quickly in some of these situations where, we're looking a year ahead and we're like, well, they were very bad decisions in terms of like the perfect storm last year with the health and so on, staying and tracking much differently than it had in previous years. So it will be intriguing to see how those veterans hold up moving into another season here as we move forward.
Real quick, just on that note, because you talked about the changing teams. The other interesting part about this last year was the narrative of changing teams is bad, and that was generally true beforehand. But what was so interesting about this last year, and I think it's because the running back prices across like the NFL, like in terms of like actual dollars, is all of the aging running backs all went to significantly better teams, like Jacobs,
better situations,
just going to the Packers, obviously with Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley. So it was like the perfect storm for everything to kind of go right. I think that's the hard part about this is, yes, they're older, but these running backs, these aging running backs, are all still on like the very best teams, like McCaffrey, Derrick Henry, Saquon. I'll throw Josh Jacobs in there. Like that's going to be the tricky part of this, because their efficiency could climb, kind of like tick down a little bit. But if they're still scoring a bunch of touchdowns because they're on the best offenses, like maybe it's not going to matter this season.
Yeah, a player that I have a lot of concern about efficiency in the it's in the 3rd round at underdog is Kyren Williams, and there is, though, again, in one of the better offenses off the NFL, like the could all fit into that situation. The other thing that was interesting last year, if we look at even like a Joe Mixon, who is now going in the 6th round and has some negative news about his health over the last couple of days, but it just like everything clicked into like if you drafted like running backs through those opening 5 rounds at the start of the season in particular, there wasn't many situations where it wasn't going in a positive direction. Tony Pollard was going in a positive direction, so it was all pretty. Like you couldn't really went wrong if you drafted running backs early at a certain point. The other interesting part is like when it got to the time to win in the playoffs, it really kind of fell in the opposite direction in a lot of those particular situations. When you look through the entire article, and I know you got some information from Tom Strachan, who we were communicating on social media about with some of the RotoViz data and that.
Mhm.
But was there anything that kind of stood out that shocked you from the research?
Yeah, so I think that the first like kind of big takeaway is just the winning the flex. Part of the ADP discussion previously was like, hey, like you're not sacrificing any points for these wide receivers. The floors are generally safer. It's positioned with fewer like there's like more scarcity because there's fewer like late round breakouts. But now since the ADPs have changed, like now like that win the flex term to me is like really taking a hit because like right now winning the flex, these round 5 running backs way outproduce the round 5 wide receivers in projections preseason. So obviously there's a lot of volatility here, but that was like one thing that kind of ticked down this like the last couple of seasons is that the win the flex narrative I think did take a hit. But at the same time, that did lead me to like the number one conclusion where I think that zero RB teams have generally been drafting too many wide receivers. And it kind of just goes into the philosophy like if you're drafting these guys early, you got to bank on these. And the best way that you can use your wide receiver points is by just betting that these guys are going to stay healthy and be the 4 or 5 wide receivers that you need. So, like, for example, like through round 10, it's been like really good to only have 5 wide receivers. And that includes even in the seasons where zero RB has been fantastic. And that's been pretty helpful is like having those 2 years where zero running back was awesome. Even in those seasons, like only having like 5 wide receivers through round 10 was optimal. And I think I see too many teams drafting zero RB where they're drafting a 6th wide receiver by round 10, or they're still drafting an 8th wide receiver, a 7th wide receiver. Like to me, I would like kind of take zero running back and make it like a pretty extreme build where like I don't have that many wide receivers. I didn't add a lot of depth either. But man, if these 5 wide receivers are studs, that's it. And I think that's kind of my big takeaway is just in general, the diminishing returns even happen at wide receiver. And I think that the diminishing returns actually happen a little bit earlier than people are expecting. So like 4 wide receivers through round 6, I think that's plenty. I don't think you need a 5th or a 6th. And I think that only having 5 through round 10 was something I tinkered with. And then some of the best zero running back teams like only had like 6 wide receivers through round 18 as well. And I think that just the diminishing returns like so obvious if you're looking at the data. And I do think that qualifies for the wide receiver position as well.
I do think at times I will find myself being pretty overly aggressive. I know with some of my co-managers, there's times where they're trying to get me to pull back on some of those wide receivers, but I do agree with you on the 4 through 6, the 5 through 10. I would often in situations be looking at like 5 through 7, 5 through 8, but I think the key is to have the 4 early. Like if you say 5 through 10, like there's very big difference in having like 4 of those through 6 or having 5 through 10. I think you have to like pair those together. The other part that I was interested, if you thought anything from when you're working through it, the win the flex, you have mentioned that the more people draft zero RB, the worse that part of the strategy gets. But then when we're looking at the landscape now, and you mentioned it ticking down over the last couple of years, I'm intrigued to see after this year's data how much of that is going to be down to the more people adopted the strategy. So if you mentioned, I think you said 5x earlier in terms of the amount of people that did it. Well, that obviously leads to the strength that you could have at the wide receiver position at the flex being less than what it would have been, prior to people creating the usage. Do you think there'll be a bounce back in that kind of area of the strategy?
I think what's going to happen is there's still like going to be a generally the same amount of wide receivers drafted through the first 60-ish overall picks. I think like the ADP suggests that. I just don't think that there's going to be as many teams like starting with 5 wide receivers in a row. They're going to take that running back detour before it.
Yeah.
But more teams, like everyone kind of understands like you do need wide receivers early. I just think you're probably going to see fewer amount of teams like absolutely going crazy with wide receivers where it's just that you start with like 5 in a row. I think there's probably going to be fewer of those teams. I think correctly, instead of that 5th wide receiver, they're mixing in that Kenneth Walker or that Omarion Hampton, or you pick your favorite running back that you think's in the prime of their career. And you're kind of like taking the same zero running back approach and like kind of theory, but you're taking that detour into the other direction, at least in half PPR. So I wonder if like the same amount of running backs and wide receivers going to be drafted in the first 60, 75 overall picks, but just like which teams are going down each avenue, I think it's going to be like slightly different. I think that's probably for the better.
I would agree in terms of the numbers that are drafted, but then, what the idea originally of winning the flex would become that you could have that additional 1 or 2 wide receivers of strength versus what the rest of the teams are doing. Because if the other teams are being more balanced, just to try and like gain that leverage at that particular spot off the roster. And I think it does just my kind of point is it'll become a little bit easier to manufacture that when, people aren't going absolutely crazy at the same profiles. You mentioned 2 running backs that I would be interested in detouring for, but there's also a lot of running backs that go in the first 5 rounds that I have absolutely no interest in. So again, similar to if people are drafting the wide receivers in that range that I'm not interested in, it's going to hopefully help out. The next part that I want to jump into is, when it's optimal to draft those running backs. You do mention in the article that round 7 is the latest to draft your running back 1. Where did you come across the optimal spot? And this is obviously for Underdog half point PPR for those particular contests that we are talking about for this particular article. But where were you find, and round 7, like that, you're get, even for somebody like myself who likes to wait on, you're getting, you don't want to be going too far down past that.
Yes.
What are you seeing in terms of optimal, in terms of the running backs through certain rounds?
In that caveat that you hit on, we cannot stress that enough. In full PPR, the data could look different. In redraft, it can look different. I do think that is a big discussion here, and maybe why there's so many 0 running back teams. So much of the data comes from full PPR, and then you're applying it to half PPR. Maybe that's where some of the disagreements I've had. But the last in 2022 and 2023, great years for 0 RB. Even in those seasons, you can see teams that did not have a running back in round 8, round 9, round 10. Those teams are significantly lower than the teams that finally added their first running back in that round 5, 6, 7, 8 range. And that's even with, I'm assuming a lot of those teams had Devon Achane, Kyron Williams, you name the late breakout running back. It just did not matter that you had that 6 wide receiver versus just staying afloat and adding some running back points along the way. So it's if you had that mindset, I want to overload on wide receivers, I want to find the upside plays at running back, whether that's contingent or just ambiguous backfields. But along the way, you still want to take a detour to, and that's kind of the evidence that I have is in half PPR, even in those 0 running back years, the drop off from scoring, if you didn't have a running back in rounds 8, 9, 10, was pretty significant versus the teams that finally drafted one in round 6 or round 7.
And the other thing, to head on again, is we're obviously talking about Underdog and, Best Ball Mania, those sorts of things. But again, if you are listening to this and you're playing in a PPR league, there's a lot of different ways that these play out. And even in the case of playing on Underdog and you're drafting through 18 rounds versus if you're playing somewhere else and draft through 20 rounds, that changes kind of the dynamic of the kind of roster allocation that you want to have with those sort of things. But the PPR element versus the half pointer, definitely when you get to standard as well, is going to impact the ability, because you can't just pick a pass catching running back who, if we go back 8-9 years, Giovanni Bernard was kind of a poster boy for the satellite back at the time, and that would be able to get you that floor of those receiving points. But in these cases, it's not the case. You mentioned then in the article 6 running backs through 18 rounds. Did that alter much based on when that first running back would be selected?
Yeah, definitely. So this is just if you are drafting a more 0 RB approach and kind of splitting the difference. Let's say your first running back's in round 5, 6, or 7 and not some extreme version of this. You still want 6 running backs. You don't want 5, which is too few. I don't think that 7th and 8th running back, if you feel like you've needed to draft the 7th or 8th running back, you probably at some point drafted either that second tight end too early, the quarterback too early, or the wide receiver 5 or 6 too early, and you probably should have taken a detour at running back a little bit earlier. So 6 running backs has been optimal in more of a 0 running back build. Now, of course, if you are doing a more extreme version of this and you're playing for that outcome, then you can take a 7th running back. It's just generally not the way that I would like to be kind of approaching this. So it's more of just let's do 0 running back when the board falls to us. But when we do it, let's not make this the most extreme 0 running back team. It just doesn't feel like it's necessary looking at the diminishing returns, particularly in half PPR. And I think the other thing about half PPR, which is interesting, is in full PPR, there's some running backs that could matter for your flex that just don't in half PPR. I think Giovanni Bernard was a perfect example. In half PPR, dude, Giovanni Bernard means more or less nothing to me. It's just not mattering that much. But in full PPR, you can find these Tariq Cohen seasons and obviously all those Patriots running backs where they very clearly mattered. But if you take away a lot of their production with the half PPR scoring, you're just losing running backs that could actually be an RB2 in the season. So I think that's another kind of interesting distinction, is that even at half PPR, you're losing they're in full PPR, you're adding 3 or 4 running backs that actually would matter that just don't because of the scoring.
Then obviously, like I find hero RB is kind of the sweet spot for people who maybe didn't want to draft hero RB in the past. But if you're drafting in general, and I know obviously we go into a room and we see how the room develops. It's not a case of just going in and sitting in a specific direction of what you want to do in that draft. But would you class yourself as in general, a hero RB or a zero RB or a robust kind of? What would your general strategy be?
It's the most boring answer, but I like just the most balanced teams. Like if it's like 3-3 or 2 running backs, 4 wide receivers through kind of round 6, and then a lot of my teams through round 10, it's like 3 or 5 or 4 and 4, and it's kind of playing it that way. So I drafted a bunch of different style teams. I really like let the board fall to me, but in half PPR with these ADPs, I'm more inclined to have probably a second and third running back a little earlier than people. I'm not a zero or a robust running back guy by nature, but I do have some 3 running back teams. And even this year, like I've been experimenting a little bit more with just like 4 running back teams and then just like loading up on 3 tight end, 3 quarterback builds. That's only just because the ADPs have fallen so much over the years. Like I would be less inclined to advise people to have 3 running backs in the first 5 rounds. Like if we had 2021 ADPs. So that's kind of where I'm at. I do draft some 0 running back teams, but the board really kind of has to fall to me. I'm probably more likely to have 4 wide receivers and a running back detour through round 5, which is like not technically 0 running back, but it's like applying a lot of the same principles.
And again, another word I love when people bring it out is the principles, because I think, zero RB obviously is a catchy name, but it is about the principles rather than the name of the zero RB. And I love when those sort of things. We'll talk about some of the principles in a second, but one of those is, people always said about you're just waiting for running backs to get injured. That's all that zero RB drafters want. But it kind of falls into the same area of, you're trying to backfill the rest of those roster spots at the running back position, but you're looking at like Saquon Barkley, Will Shipley, you're going down through the list, Christian McCaffrey, Garando. Are you looking more at those players who are going to have contingent upside in your drafts, or are you looking at the players with the standalone value early in the season? Or is it just a case of who's available?
It's a little bit of who's available, but generally it's kind of like building out the entire running back room. So it's like kind of taking a couple pieces from both. I think if you're going to like make me pick, like, is it just like these guys that might have an RB2, RB3 path or like a contingent upside play? I like the contingent upside plays a little bit more just because not only are you getting those points when you do get them, but you're also chopping off the teams that we're scared of, which are the elite running back teams that stayed healthy the entire season. So like Will Shipley matters. Like, well, there goes that Saquon Barkley team that you were just not competing with last season because he was averaging 20 plus fantasy points. So that's kind of where I'm at with this. Obviously, like Zach Charbonnet is like on like the pretty expensive side of that equation. Like I kind of like live in that Tyler Algier kind of area where it's the opportunity cost is like really kind of fallen apart. Like the wide receivers that you're drafting instead of Tyler Algier are like typically really awful. And then also like I think some of the tight end upside plays have kind of fallen apart at that point too. So I do like the Tyler Algier types as well. Marshawn Lloyd, perhaps. I think Rashad White, perhaps. This year it's like kind of hard because like Derrick Henry doesn't have like a clear guy. Ashton Genties is a freaking Raheem Mostert. Like, do we really love that? Obviously, David Montgomery goes way above this with the Jahmyr Gibbs team. So there's only so many of them, but Tyler Algier is like, to me, the like in theory, who do I like to draft? It's like the Tyler Algier type of profile.
Yeah, no, I would agree with the guys specifically. Like you're playing for the upside to win these tournaments, and that's why you want to go in and get the players who not only improve your team if it happens, but also hurt those other teams. And the downside of the floor versus the upside balance can be very difficult in some of these teams because you might have a player who's steady for part of the season, but is not going to put you over the edge when it gets particularly to the final weeks of these tournaments. When you look then at the landscape for drafting right now and some of the things we've talked through, do you think that makes it more or less viable in 2025?
So I'm going to say it's probably less viable in just because I think that the more balanced approach is the recommended play here. I just think that the diminishing return research that I've had to me just suggests that 5th wide receiver versus your first running back, that's a pretty big kind of like difference in like projected points it's going to be adding to your specific roster. So I'm more likely to have like a detour. But at the same time, it's going to be harder to find like breakout wide receivers late because the wide receivers that we want are going earlier. So I'm doing like plenty of wide receiver starts, and then kind of circling back to the running backs and kind of like the traditional dead zone. That's only because the price tags kind of fallen apart.
One of the last areas I want to get into, I've seen some of the teams that you've in the article looking at the elite tight end or the elite quarterback positions. How are you fitting that? Because I think that's a big piece of this jigsaw for how you can put the entire piece together, because the elite tight ends have got pulled up over the last couple of years. And then when you're in a situation where if you have taken, let's say, wide receiver, then it's, let's say it's a George Kittle, and then you have an elite quarterback in there as well. So you have two wide receivers through those 4 rounds. That obviously changes the picture a lot, but it gives you two elite options at those other positions. Is elite QB or elite tight end something that you're looking to add into these teams?
Definitely. So like the one way to combat this diminishing returns out over investing into wide receiver is to, instead of drafting a wide receiver, you draft one of the elite players at the other positions, and all of a sudden that diminishing returns aspect kind of goes away. So if I'm going to do a 0 running back team, it's way more likely that I have 3 or 4 wide receivers plus a Trey McBride, a George Kittle, somebody like that. The problem with that is only so many elite tight ends that you can even draft in the first 5 rounds right now. But I do think like generally like a 0 running back team with Trey McBride rather than that 5th wide receiver, I think that Trey McBride team's going to look a little bit better. And I would also throw in half PPR. I just think that generally the elite quarterbacks are undervalued just because you're chopping points off from every other position except the quarterbacks. They provide a floor right now. And then also the big part of this is Lamar, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, all these guys, and Jane Daniels. We're talking about like what, 24 years old to 28 years old. We're not talking about guys that are going to be washed. Like the sample size is in. They're in the absolute prime. When I go back and watch these guys, their decision making is much better than it was prior, and they're still the same athlete as they've always been. So like I would be pretty scared to be like, you know what, this is probably the year where Lamar and Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts are going to start to slide. It's like, no, like this is their prime. Like Lamar, these guys should have like one of the best fantasy seasons of all time. Like we're talking about like Hall of Fame players firmly in their prime with like returning offensive coordinators and stuff. So to me, like my favorite is your running back build would be like probably at the turn, like you go Nico Collins, Brian Thomas, Lamar Jackson, then pick your favorite upside shot in round 4 at wide receiver. To me, like that's a pretty awesome start. And then maybe your first running back is James Conner at like the 5-6 turn. Like to me, that's like what a by definition 0 running back team would look like. But that's a badass 0 running back team right there.
And just on the elite side, before I get into the structures element, elite tight end is something that you buy into. That's an area I find of the draft community where it's either like tight ends, they suck, or tight ends or everything. And when we look at the principles of 0 RB originally, like something that I try to pretty much in every draft is to have one of those elite tight ends. And this year I would class that probably down as far as TJ Hawkinson, but really it is those first 3 guys. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you actively are trying to get on a roster?
It's so hard looking at like historical data at that position because we're talking about like
by Rob Gronkowski and
like
Travis Kelce.
Yeah, Kelce and Gronk, like the 2 best tight ends, like stat wise, like of all time. That's what makes this so difficult. And at the same time, Brock Bowers like could easily be in that tier moving forward. We just
might be better.
Yeah, who knows what the hell is going to happen with Brock Bowers? Those numbers last year were crazy. And I also like Trey McBride. I think feels very comfortable right now, like very clearly in the prime of his career, very clearly like someone that's getting manufactured touches and knows what to do with them. You're just hoping for the tight ends to rebound or the touchdowns to rebound with him. And I think long term, like we know that's just going to happen. It's just like simple like regression that we're talking about. So I think that Brock Bowers and Trey McBride right now make a lot more sense as elite tight ends than the last couple seasons of guys we've been claiming as elite tight ends. So this is where I feel pretty comfortable. I do draft both of those guys, especially in like full PPR redraft where you have to like pick which guys you're starting. Like I want Trey McBride on those teams. I maybe have a better chance in best ball and half PPR playing the touchdown variance game with 3 tight ends, and redraft and full PPR. You don't get that luxury. So I think that Trey McBride and Brock Bowers in full PPR redraft make even more sense.
And is there part of that where you're drafting those elite tight ends or elite quarterbacks that changes the structure element of like 2 tight end versus 3 tight end, and same at quarterback? Is that part of your strategy? Again, one of the things with Underdog is the 18 rounds. It just gives you those 2 less shots at the different positions.
Yeah, it's definitely part of the calculus there, where you can draft that seventh wide receiver on a zero running back team, or that sixth or seventh running back. A lot of my teams still have 3 quarterbacks, just because I think that the projected points hitting your lineup, plus the added correlation of having the quarterback versus their cost, I still like a third quarterback most of the time. But on a Brock Bowers team, if you go Brock Bowers plus Colston Loveland, like, you kind of just call it a day there. So it really kind of depends. I have been doing like more like 3-6-6-3 teams. If I'm like investing into the wide receiver position pretty heavily early on. So yeah, but one of the benefits certainly is, if you do go Lamar Jackson, you want to stop at 2 quarterbacks, you go Lamar plus Brock Purdy, like, you can call it a day and then draft a little luxury pick at the flex positions as well. So that is definitely a benefit of drafting one of those elite options.
Last thing I'm going to hit you with is, who is your favorite 0 RB target in 2025?
Ooh, that's a great question. I do think that Algiers hits on a lot of the things that we're talking about, just because the opportunities cost is falling apart. I've seen him just like take on a bulk of the load before, which I do kind of like. There's like not like a big, you don't know who the running back 3 is. Like, if something happens to Bijan, he's going to be the guy. In terms of that, I think can just like contribute a little bit more. Tyjae Spears, I think, is just going to play a little bit more, and I think that's an offense where the offensive line looks better. You add Cam Ward, let's just see what happens with a year 3 profile, and he's dealt with injuries, so it's like I don't think we know exactly what Tyjae Spears is at this point. I think there's some upside case there, and then like all the way down, I do think that Roschon could score some goal line touchdowns for the Bears. I think Miles Sanders can play more for the Cowboys if you're looking for some plays. And then obviously on the flip side of that, all these rookies, like if you are a Basil Tutin guy, go for it. I'm a little bit nervous there, but yeah, Tank Bigsby, Roschon, Miles Sanders way down the board. But I think that Algier, Ray Davis is another great one. Maybe it's Algier and Ray Davis. I think those guys have plenty of upside, and maybe give you a couple usable weeks in best ball.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do after you named out all those is, I'm going to say that it's going to be a good year for 0 RB. And it doesn't have to be that you go completely 0 RB in the traditional sense, but there's a lot of running backs in those double-digit rounds that are very, very interesting for this season. That is the easiest way to finish up on this. But as we get ready to close up, I mentioned at the start, Hayden is over at Underdog, but you can find him on the Underdog Fantasy podcast with Josh Norris as well. You can follow him on social media at Hayden Winks. But Hayden, you've lots of content coming out at the moment. Do you want to let the listeners know what they can check out?
Yeah, so as we get into August, we'll kind of go from best ball to more redraft leagues, and there's like a pretty big discussion on which players are better or worse versus each thing. And then the big thing is that it's all the training camp buzz. We got preseason games, we got just depth chart changes, so we'll be adjusting our rankings. So yeah, you can find all that stuff on Underdog Network, and the 0 running back column is over on underdognetwork.com.
Yeah, I'll have that link today in the show notes as well, so you can check that out from Hayden. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on social media at Overtime Ireland. And until we are back, have a good one.